Back in the studio at the Library of Congress, this is The Poet and the Poem from the Library of Congress. I'm Grace Cavalieri. Today, we welcome this year's 17th Marfield Award winner for writing about the arts, given by the Arts Club of Washington, D.C. Jennifer Homans, what a pleasure to meet you. Congratulations. We're so proud of you.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored, and I'm very happy to be with you here today.
This book, people need to know, competed against all other books written about the arts, and the judges considered it the best book written about the arts, with all photography, all kinds of visual arts are always submitted, and this was the winner. Did you believe all along that it was competitive in this world of books?
You know, while I'm writing a book, I really actually don't think about those things because I'm just so focused on the material.
And how did you write this book? I mean, you have chronicled almost all of Balenchines' dances. Well, let's start with the name of the book and what it's about.
Yeah, the book is the story of George Balanchine's life, which begins in Russia in 1904 and ends in 1983 in the United States. So it is very much, as the title suggests, Mr. B. George Balanchine's 20th Century, a 20th Century Life.
How did you do this in one lifetime? How many years did it take?
It took me a decade of very...
Every day?
Oh, every day.
What
very
makes
hard
you
work.
go on? What made you go on?
I mean, I was driven by the subject. His life is epic and fascinating, and it led me in so many different directions that I just couldn't stop.
But I agree, this is the most consummate book of his life that exists, and you will go down in history for that. And you must have mentioned almost every dance of his hundreds of dances, and the detail. I must say, it is not just a book on dance. This is a book full of psychological action, adventure. It is, I actually couldn't stop turning the pages. It is not a history book. It's something more.
Well,
it's
thank
a
you.
Psychology. Yes. So just tell us a little bit about the research.
The research was on several different levels. I did over 100 interviews. I worked in archives in Russia and in the United States and across Europe. I went to the places Balanchine had lived and walked his walks, his patterns from his childhood home to the school where he studied, things like that. And I spent a lot of time in attics trying to uncover new materials.
Well, it's 800 pages long, about 200 have footnotes, and it is never boring, not for one moment. So you cover ballet from before the Russian Revolution to present day. And I wanted to know, I thought to myself, when an author spends this much of her life, what does she want from us? What do you wish the reader would feel after they close the book?
Maybe I hope that the reader would feel some of the awe I felt for this life, and not always, admiration necessarily, but the full weight of the 20th century absorbed by this individual in all its horror and beauty, and then digested and in some way given to us in a remade form of dance.
It's a history of the century, and the matrix is dance.
Exactly.
And so you had a huge context to do. And you are a scholar, we'll get to that too. But I would love you to read a sample of the book.
I thought I'd start with the beginning itself in the first chapter called Dead Souls. It begins like this. This, the suffering, the grit, the hardship of everyday life, never once appeared in Balanchine's dances. It did not interest him. It was pedestrian, a degradation of the human body and spirit. Even the dead bodies in his ballets were set against a backdrop of eternity and had a sense of spirituality and redemption that elevated the body out of the ordinary. Dead bodies, yes, but really dead souls. These were bodies purified and transfigured by the disciplined practices of ballet, and if loss was a theme in his dances, so were love and full-fleshed joy. He made many gorgeous costumed ballets that built to a crescendo with colorful kaleidoscope patterns of dancers synchronizing ever more complicated and demanding rhythms. These were fantastic entertainments that lifted the audience into the great good humor of being alive. He saw himself as a musician and theater man, a traveling ballet master, and he had worked in great opera houses and touring troupes, from the Russian Tsar's Mariinsky Theater to his training and youth at the Paris Opera, to Broadway, Hollywood, and his own New York City Ballet, which he founded in 1948. He said he was a showman, and like the old Commedia dell'arte performers, he reinvented himself many times. He seemed ageless, for his dancers, even at the end of his life, Mr. B, as they called him, was a god, and they surrendered their young lives for a chance to dance his glorious ballets.
Let's hear a little more.
There was some part of him that did not think of himself as mortal at all. I am not male. I am water and air, and I am servant, he said. Or, I am a cloud in trousers, he said, a phrase borrowed from a poem he had learned early in life by the Russian poet Vladimir Mayakovsky. Some of the dancers who knew him best secretly called him the breath, another word for spirit, really.
This is the history of the arts. We have Picasso, we have Coco Chanel, we have all of the great artists. Gropius is even in there. Every poet, Mayakovsky, every poet or artist was involved with him.
He passed through so many worlds, and he absorbed everything that came his way, it seems.
Wow. This is a book that I think is going to go on longer than we will. What did you have to overcome to write this book?
I mean, the book has origins, I suppose, in my own life. In my personal life, I had experienced some great loss and the death of my husband 2 years before I started it. And I was groping with the loss and with the idea of loss. And I found myself going back to his dances over and over again. And then I realized that there was something about these dances that was both so human, but also full of loss, and that he had dealt with those subjects. And of course, I had danced those dances, but the overcoming had to do with I suppose, my own grief.
Wow. So this filled that void, perhaps.
I threw myself into it.
Yes, you did. And you, we have to say, are a dancer, and actually studied at the American Ballet School of Balenchines. How tough was that?
That was such an experience, to be dropped out of a pretty traditional academic family from the Midwest into this Russian world in New York City.
How did you do that? I mean, so you were very talented, and you had to audition. But I heard that it was so rigorous and asked so much of the human body. Did you find that extraordinary?
I did find it extraordinary, and I found it completely engrossing. I mean, I realized very early on that there was only one way to deal with the demands and the discipline, and that was you either had to leave or you had to submit.
Which brings me to the first ballerinas that came to his school from Europe when he first began. They were all children of emigres. Now, I wondered, is that because the only place people were trained well was in Europe?
I think it was that the parents of these young dancers came from Europe and understood that dance was an important art form, and so they were drawn to Balenchine, who was also an exile and emigre. And it's true that these early companies, the early school in the 30s and 40s, really were overwhelmingly from these Central European families.
Only later on did he get some wasps in there.
Exactly.
And my other image of ballet dancers, I think, first of all, you're all what we dreamed of being when we were little girls, in front of our mirrors, and you actually lived the life. But I thought ballet dancers went to bed at 8 o'clock, and they ate vegetables, and they put face cream on, and they were perfect. Oh my gosh, when I read this book, and during especially the tours, and finding out that they lived on Spam and instant coffee, especially during, say, the World War, and they slept for 3 hours and then would dance, and that they could dance with a hangover. I mean, I really learned a lot. And maybe they still do this.
They were human beings.
They're human beings. That's
They're
what
young
I didn't know.
people. They're young people, 18, 19, 20, into their early 20s. But they were hungry for life, and the company gave them a chance to see Europe and to see the world even
But
in the later years.
I think they are still human beings.
Of course,
and they have babies, and all kinds of myths were broken here. One thing I learned a lot was about the music, because this is all about how music is the foundation of the dance. And there's so much about the history of music here. And his friendship with Stravinsky. You did it all.
Well, the music was, as he put it, it was the floor on which the dance could take place. It was really the basis of everything. And he was seriously classically trained. So
in literature as well.
And in literature as well. And I mean, he was kind of a self-educated person, but he had a great base, especially in music. But he had enormous appetite for literature and this was something I discovered. Often he didn't admit it during his life, but he sometimes would say to a dancer, "Oh, don't take class today. Go read War and Peace."
Yes, yes. That was he was so large.
He was so large.
A cloud in trousers, for sure. Well, you left dance to get a PhD in modern European history. What was that decision like?
Yeah, I decided that, I had always been a curious person, and I wanted to understand better. I wanted to read books, and I wanted to understand better the world I had come from. I couldn't figure out what was this ballet thing all about, and why were we doing this, and where did those steps come from? And so I started to do some research on it, and
got a doctorate.
And I did. I got a doctorate, and I did it in European history because I didn't want to study dance the way I had danced. I wanted to study the context.
I find that very unusual for a performer to go into that world from performing, because you were with a corps and danced professionally.
No, absolutely. I had a context because my father was a professor, so I knew what that world was about. But I thought for a while, I'm going to leave the dance behind. It has nothing to do with the academy and words are a very suspicious thing to dancers. Words can get in your way because you want to be in music, not in words.
And all that came together, and then you're the founding director of the Center for Ballet and the Arts. What do you do in that center?
Yeah, I founded the center almost at the same time I started the work on Mr. B. And
in your spare time?
In my spare time. It's a center at NYU where we bring together artists and scholars to work on dance. So we have scholars from physics and history and art history and literature, and we have artists, all of whom are interested in dance. Some are choreographers, some are not.
And you're called a scholar at NYU.
I am a scholar.
Well.
I'm a professor. I teach there.
Oh, yeah. In addition to the center.
In addition to the center, yes.
What makes you go? I want to eat what you eat. I just want to eat what you eat.
Well, they're all wonderful opportunities.
Yeah.
So
and you're still young, and you've done it. You've really done quite a bit. Let's hear another bit from the book, and remind people of the title of this book and what it's about.
So this is another piece from Mr. B, George Balenchines' 20th Century, and I am going to read to you from a chapter called Agon, which is about a 1957 dance that he choreographed. It's a kind of the midpoint in the book and the midpoint in his life, and it was a very breakthrough and radical ballet. On a more personal level, Agon revealed Balenchines' innermost ambition. It came from the thing he had come to care about most: service. Service to music, to women, to dancers, to his wife at the time, Tanaki Leclerc, and to God. Wasn't it all the same thing? Every dance has many authors, and George never stopped saying that without his dancers, he would have no dances. It was they who absorbed his pulse and timing, his gesture and images, his dance. He moved through them. In these moments, he had no individuality, no manness, no self. All cloud, no trousers. And those months and years of near impossible ballet classes had broken his dancers of excess. They were trained to execute steps as accurately and precisely as possible, nothing more. Who had time to do anything in Agon but count to stay alive, which does not mean their individuality was erased. To the contrary, George built the dances around who they were. He just didn't want them to add anything extra to who they were. No sauce, no affectation, no drama, no acting, no interpretation. On stage that night, he resolved the paradox. They were at once themselves and a company of selfless dancers in service to Agon. Even a ballet could be an emanation of God. It was a moment. Balenchine had become Balenchine. The question of Agon was the question of ballet itself. What is this thing that banishes fear and pain, and yet is itself based on fear and pain, that admits no bestiality, and yet is itself bestial, or at least animalistic, that hangs its harmonious bodies like angels in blue light, but screams flesh and blood, that coldly strips the body of ornament and display, fabric and costumes, removing it once and for all from the clothed civility of society, that insists that the deed, the dance, is greater than the word, and that a dance has no past, only a fleeting present. You will not glimpse these creatures in all the history of art. Who are these strangely voluptuous and depleted figures, seemingly bent on weight and their own physical and erotic presence, but also on disappearance into the nothingness of spirit and air? Agon was one answer.
Perfectly put. Spirit and air. It is said that he was convention and progressive both at once, which is quite a thing to be. I think that when you're reviewed, and I haven't read all of your reviews yet, but I think what they're missing is that very thing you ended with, and that is that he had this adoration of the female, this idealized idea, and this adoration is what he wanted to form into dance. And it wasn't as exploitive as I think sometimes believe he is. It wasn't an exploitation of the female. It was a belief in that as almost a religion, as a love of form. If he could just get what was paranormal and make it real and material. He was trying for a lot.
Exactly. He was a mystic in a way.
Yes.
And he saw that, he aspired, as he put it, to do something a little higher. He was
It's so
after
true.
the fourth dimension, he would say. We are trying to do something extraordinary. We don't live in dance in the ordinary world. That world is pedestrian. What we're trying to do is use the body to elevate the body and the mind and the spirit.
Do you believe he did that?
I do believe he did that.
As no other has ever done?
I do believe he did it as no other has ever done.
And all of his followers, too, branched off. Of course, great ballet leaders came from him as well. And there are all kinds of conflicts in this book and business problems, and of course, the drama of his own health. Do you want to tell us a little bit about his own pathway through life? It was impeded from the very beginning.
It was because he was born during the imperial period in 1904, but the revolution and the war were quick upon them, and his childhood was really interrupted, in some ways decimated by violence.
So he was studying ballet as a child.
He was,
and then cast out on the street to find animals to eat, actually, and then go back and dance.
Exactly. His family, his mother was there for a little while, but then the family went to Georgia, which is where the father was from. And he was left in St. Petersburg, and he was really at his own resources, scavenging for food, often starving, welts on his body. He was spitting blood from TB. And yet, he was also being inspired by a revolutionary, radical art movement that was taking hold in St. Petersburg.
And the thought of dancers, of these young children dancing with their breath so cold in these buildings that they could see their breath as they were dancing.
Yeah, no heat. And the floors, basically, if you spilled your drink on it, they would turn to ice. So, and they would wear these coats as they went on stage and then take them off as they came off.
It's a miracle he survived, isn't it? The human spirit's big, isn't it?
It is, and this is the thing. You know, he shouldn't have survived. He wasn't a strong constitution, and he did survive, and he survived, as you were indicating, several other difficult moments. He was in a sanatorium for TB in Switzerland in a magic mountain. And he should have died then too, but he didn't. So he developed this whole idea of, it has to be now because you don't know if you're going to be dead.
Yes, yes. Death is the mother of beauty, as a poet said. And don't you find that it is understandable and yet extraordinary that he married other ballet dancers? How could that work?
Yeah, as you said, the people he married, the women he married were all great dancers, and he was interested in them as dancers. That was his source. Love was his source. Love and eroticism. Those were his.
And sometimes he played house with a wife, and sometimes it was a different kind of marriage. And you have chronicled all of them. You read the letters of some of his wives?
I read the letters, especially that he wrote to Vera Zorina, which we still have. He destroyed lots of things, or they got lost, or other people didn't keep them. So there's not much, but those letters are a testament to a deeply romantic person.
Where are those letters?
Those letters are right here at the Library of Congress.
In the room down the hall.
In the room down the hall.
And predominant in this book is Suzanne Farrell.
Absolutely.
Who is still alive.
Indeed.
And very much teaching, I think, and still alive and well. And that was a huge part of your book. The last, maybe fourth of your book is about Suzanne Farrell.
Well, she was an obsession and an extraordinary dancer.
But I don't understand how he could say, go do what you feel like doing to the music. He would say, do what you want here to the music. And I guess the ballet dancers were so intuitive and so well trained that they could pull that off. A lot was extemp, wasn't it?
It was, and there was, he worked with these dancers for years. So it wasn't like a pickup company. He knew them. He had talked with them. He had worked with them. This was part of the whole process of, what I call sculpting their bodies, which was also, of course, an emotional, physical, psychological. The whole person was involved.
But he made them do more than most masters do.
They had to
do more with their limbs than one could do.
Absolutely.
And yet they did it.
They did it, and, they always said, this is not easy. It's not that this is it could be painful, it could be difficult. There were issues around weight, he could be ruthless in his vision and in his desire for his art and for them as tools of his art, but he also could liberate them.
That's the word.
So he would, they would work together, and then they would be on stage, that's their world.
He gave them what they always dreamed of, to be more than mortal. And you have another book voted the best of its year, Apollo's Angels, and that's the history of ballet. So how did that soften the earth so that you had a little bit of running space to get into this book?
It taught me so many things. Writing Apollo's Angels was an exploration into the history of dance from Louis XIV and from the Italian Renaissance even, straight up through the Cold War and into the Balenchine era. So I had the big picture in my mind. And so when I went to Balenchine, I could dig deeper on this part of it.
Balenchine. What does he mean to you?
Oh, that's a big question.
But doesn't he symbolize something that we all want in the arts?
He does.
The unobtainable.
He's a great, great artist who gave people an experience at its best of transcendence, and at its most difficult, an experience that was full of aspiration and loneliness and difficulty, cruelty even. So there's an epic and human story in his whole life. And
the psychological
to me,
action.
at the end of the book, you were asking about that earlier, I also felt myself anyway, sad, because it's a lonely life, even though he was married 5 times. You know, it's a lonely life, this pursuit of something otherworldly.
It is, but it is the pursuit. And that's what this book is about. Jennifer Homans, you have done something never done before. I don't even know we know the extent of it yet. We do know that it won the Marfield Award, which is equal to the Pulitzer for the best book, and this is about writing in the arts. Will you read us a final bit of the book? Mr. B.
I thought I would read to you from the final chapter, a couple of paragraphs. The book begins in a real life and it ends in a dance, because it's a book about the imagination, and I felt that the only place he could die was in one of his dances. And he did choreograph a dance in 1980, 3 years before he died, that was often understood as his own
Requiem.
his own death.
Yes.
Yeah, his own requiem. It ended with a question. A little boy dressed in white appears holding a candle. A man asks him, "Tell me where this light comes from." The boy blows out the candle and replies, "If you tell me where this light went, I will tell you where it comes from." It was a Sufi parable, perhaps of Turkish origin, Balenchines said, implying not far from his Georgian roots. Adagio Lamentoso didn't take much rehearsal. There were no steps, just gestures and bodies slumped and emptied in grief. There were no roles, no names, no curtain calls. Unusually, the dancers were not even listed in the program. It was performed only once, at the closing movement of the closing ballet on the closing night of the Tchaikovsky Festival in 1981, just as Balenchines' illness was overtaking him. Later, no one could quite remember these dances or what they had done that night. Even the lighting cues were not written out but hastily scribbled, since they knew the ballet would not be repeated. It was as if the tissue of the ballet dissolved in their bodies as they performed it, leaving no trace. Nothing. It was made from wisps of movement and memory. There were shadows of the monks from his uncle's investiture at the great Kazan Cathedral, and of the choreographer Golizovsky's breathing cross in war-stricken revolutionary Petrograd. There were the seraphim of the Orthodox Church, which he had woven through the Nutcracker and into Noah and the Flood and Don Quixote. There was the innocent child, the mystical themes and parables, and Karen, running like the wind and mourning like the fates. And of course, there was Tchaikovsky, who seemed to span all time and all Russias, and had accompanied Balanchine from his youth to his first American dance and through to this, his final sojourn. Tchaikovsky's tremendous score brought them all together, the old dancers and the new, the ones who were there and the ones who were not, the women he had loved and the people who had come, and the stagehands responsible for putting out the lights. They were all his people, his animals, his spirit world, his life.
That's the voice of Jennifer Homans, winner of this year's Marfield Award for the best book in writing about the arts. And I believe it is a consummate book on what makes art. This is given by the Arts Club of Washington, D.C., and the series is produced by Forest Woods Media Productions, post-production by Mike Turpin, MET Studios. We wish to thank the Library of Congress for making the program possible. Funding is provided by the Maryland State Arts Council, the Sinipit Fund, Bravada Foundation, Natalie Canavore, and Sandy Jackson Cohen. I'm Grace Cavalieri, and our engineer is Mike Turpin.